A police officer with a prejudiced glare pulls over a black man, attempting to use his authority to intimidate him. What he doesn't realize is that this man is the chief of internal affairs, the person who holds his career in his hands. This story showcases a tense clash between prejudice and justice, exposing the truth about abuse of power. Where are you watching this story? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and meaningful stories. The city of Sacramento, bathed in twilight, exuded a serene beauty that was almost enchanting. The vibrant hues of orange, pink, and soft lavender painted the sky, blending harmoniously and reflecting off the buildings and streets below. The hum of traffic filled the air as people hurried home after a long day. David Williams was no exception. David, a confident and captivating black man, sat behind the wheel of a sleek black sedan, a symbol of his professionalism and success. His tailored gray suit fit him perfectly, complemented by polished black shoes, while his laptop rested carefully on the seat beside him, a testament to a busy day at the office. He had just wrapped up an important meeting, his mind still racing with unfinished plans and strategies. Yet, the gentle evening air and the soothing notes of jazz on the radio brought a fleeting moment of calm, a brief pause before he returned to the comfort of his home. As his car rolled slowly through an intersection, the traffic light shifted from yellow to red. David braked and came to a complete stop, waiting for the green light to proceed. He didn't notice the flicker of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror at first, a faint glimmer that suddenly intensified, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Frowning slightly, he wondered what he could have done wrong. The siren blared insistently. David took a deep breath, steadying himself, and pulled over to the side of the road with deliberate calm. From the police cruiser emerged Tom Mitchell, a tall, imposing officer in a meticulously pressed uniform, exuding the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding authority. Adjusting his belt, his eyes scanned David's car, landing on his face through the windshield. David lowered his window, his expression composed. Tom approached with a swagger, his voice firm and edged with something sharp. "License and registration," he demanded, offering no explanation. David studied him for a moment, unease creeping in despite his composed demeanor. His tone remained polite. "Is there a problem, officer?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on David as if searching for something, some reason, any reason. "We'll talk about that after license and registration, if you don't mind." David opened the glove compartment slowly, retrieving his license and registration. His hand was steady even though he felt the weight of Tom's scrutinizing stare pressing down on him. As Tom took the documents, his eyes never left David, and in that fleeting moment, David sensed something familiar: prejudice. What should have been a routine traffic stop began to reveal layers of deeper meaning. David realized this encounter might not be as ordinary as he had initially thought. Tom grabbed the driver's license and registration from David's hand, his eyes darting quickly over the information but lingering just a moment longer than necessary. A tense silence stretched between them, not the kind of silence that brought calm, but the kind that hinted at impending conflict. "You ran a yellow light," Tom said, his voice steady but lacking the impartial tone it should have carried. David tilted his head slightly, keeping his voice calm. "I came to a full stop when the light turned red, officer. If there's been a misunderstanding, I'm happy to clarify." Tom let out a quiet scoff, delaying his response. He kept his gaze fixed on David, not just studying his documents or his driving habits, but observing him intently. His tailored suit, his neatly trimmed hair, and his confident yet unpretentious demeanor. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked abruptly, his brows lifting in a way that felt more like a challenge than a question. David paused briefly. "My address is on my license," he replied, his eyes not wavering from Tom's. But Tom didn't seem interested in his answer. "An address is one thing," he said, his tone turning dry. "But my instincts tell me something else. Why were you in such a hurry to get through that intersection?" The question made David more acutely aware of the unusual tone in Tom's behavior. This wasn't how an officer typically questioned a traffic violation. It felt personal, as though he were looking for a reason to prolong this interaction. "I wasn't in a hurry," David said firmly, maintaining his composure. "I was driving home. As I said, I stopped when the light turned red." Tom smirked, a fleeting expression devoid of warmth. "Home? Where's home?" "As I mentioned," David said, his voice still calm but with an edge of sharpness, "the information is on my license. If anything is unclear, you're welcome to check again." Tom nodded but made no move to examine the documents further. Instead, he stood there, his gaze dissecting David as though he were trying to peel back layers. "Where do you work?" he pressed, veering further away from the original reason for stopping him. David felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. It was an interrogation. Not of his driving, but of his identity, of his presence, and perhaps of his skin color. "I don't believe that question is relevant to why you pulled me over, officer," he said, for the first time allowing a trace of coldness into his voice. Tom squinted slightly, his movements deliberate. "Sometimes I ask questions that aren't strictly about traffic violations," he said, his tone dripping with implication. "Just trying to get to know the person I'm speaking with, especially when they don't seem like the people I usually see around here." The last words hung in the air, stretched out and dropped like a gauntlet. David didn't reply immediately, but he understood Tom's meaning all too well. Not like the people he usually saw, his words weren't about David's suit or his car. They were about something he couldn't hide in his gaze, his prejudice. "Well," David said slowly, his voice measured, "I hope your curiosity doesn't delay me too long on my way home." Tom gave a slight chuckle but didn't back down. "You know," he said, "people often hide a lot when they try too hard to be polite. Anything you're hiding, Mr. Williams?" His final question made the air between them feel heavier. Tom was no longer just a police officer enforcing the law. He was probing for something, or perhaps simply trying to assert dominance. David could sense that this wasn't about a routine traffic stop at all. It was a power play, veiled under the guise of procedure. Even so, he didn't flinch. He knew that showing any fear or hesitation would only give Tom more reason to push further. But with every word and action of Tom's, David understood. He was facing a challenge far greater than just this interaction. A challenge to maintain his dignity and self-respect while confronting a system that had produced individuals like Tom. Tom tilted his head, his gaze sharpening as though he had just made a critical decision. After a tense moment of silence, he straightened his back and issued a command, his voice low but firm. "Step out of the car." David's brow furrowed slightly. "Officer," he said, his tone calm but tinged with curiosity, "could you explain the reason? I've fully cooperated and haven't committed any serious violations." Tom smirked, his smile laced with mockery. "Are you arguing against a lawful police request? That's not exactly the smartest way to handle this." His words carried a thinly veiled threat, a warning that any resistance, verbal or otherwise, could escalate the situation. David understood this unspoken message clearly. He drew a deep breath, keeping his tone measured but resolute. "I'm not arguing," he replied, his eyes locked on Tom. I just want to ensure we both understand the reason behind your request. Tom's gaze bore into him, his mocking smile fading, replaced by the steely expression of someone asserting authority. I don't have to explain everything to you, he said, his voice deeper, heavier. Step out of the car. Now. David knew that refusing could turn the situation volatile. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the car door, and stepped out. In that moment, he could feel Tom's scrutinizing gaze as he evaluated him from head to toe. His poised demeanor, tailored suit, and polished black shoes seemed to clash with whatever preconceived image Tom had of a black man in this context. Tom took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. Place your hands on the hood, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. David met his eyes directly, his gaze unflinching, calm but piercing. What exactly are you suspecting, officer? He asked, his voice steady and firm. Tom let out a derisive chuckle, though it didn't reach his eyes. Standard procedure, he said, the sarcastic undertone in his voice making the explanation feel more like an attack. You never know what someone might be carrying. Better safe than sorry. David chose not to respond. He understood that any remark he made could be twisted into a justification for further intimidation. Turning, he slowly placed his hands on the hood as instructed, his posture straight and unyielding. Tom approached, his boots clicking audibly on the pavement in the strained silence. He began his search, but his actions felt deliberate, unnecessarily prolonged, as though he were trying to assert dominance. His hands moved slowly, lingering in ways that weren't simply about security protocol. You're taking longer than necessary, officer, David said, his voice maintaining its composed edge, though an unmistakable steeliness crept in. Tom didn't respond immediately. He finished the search, stepping back with a frustrated expression. You're clean, he muttered, as if the result was somehow disappointing. David turned to face him, his stance firm. I fully cooperated, he said, his tone even, though his eyes gleamed with determination. Now can you tell me the real reason behind all of this? For a moment, Tom didn't reply, as though weighing his options. Instead of offering an explanation, he shrugged, his cold eyes meeting David's. You seem awfully familiar with this process, he said, his tone low and laden with implication. This isn't your first time, is it? David didn't answer immediately, his gaze remaining steady, unwavering against Tom's provocation. He understood that this was no longer about a traffic stop. It was about power, a power Tom was wielding not just as a police officer, but as someone embodying deep-seated prejudice. He could sense the tension thickening, the unspoken lines being drawn. But beneath it all, he knew something else with unshakable certainty. Tom had chosen the wrong person to test his authority against. David held his gaze steady, his eyes locked onto Tom, not because he wanted to provoke him, but because he understood that silence could sometimes be the most potent weapon. But this time, he chose to break the silence with a sharp question. Do you often stop men in suits driving cars like mine? The question rang out clearly, without a trace of hesitation. His words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a challenge, forcing Tom to confront the absurdity of his actions. Tom hesitated momentarily, caught off guard by David's audacity. But his uncertainty lasted only a fraction of a second. He quickly rebuilt his usual wall of defense, the mocking smirk reappearing on his face. You should be careful with your tone, Tom said, his voice low and cold, though a flicker of impatience flashed in his eyes. I'm just trying to do my job. You wouldn't want to make things more difficult, would you? David raised an eyebrow, his expression betraying a hint of mockery. I'm fully cooperating, officer. But if you're dragging this out to find a reason, maybe you should be a bit more upfront about it." Tom's grip on his belt tightened, an almost unconscious gesture to mask the unease creeping in. "Upfront," he repeated, his tone sharpening. "Are you suggesting I'm deliberately giving you a hard time?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he offered a calm but unwavering look. "I didn't say that," he replied, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of an unspoken accusation. "I just find it curious how much time you're spending asking questions unrelated to a traffic situation." Tom froze as if David's words had struck a nerve. But rather than retreat, he chose to escalate the situation. "You seem to know a lot about what I'm authorized to do," he said, his voice dropping to a provocative tone. "Is there something you're hiding?" David's lips curled into a fleeting, unfriendly smile. "Hiding," he echoed, drawing the word out as if deliberating its meaning. "No, I don't think I have anything to hide. But I find it interesting that you'd think so." Tom stepped closer, encroaching on David's personal space. "Interesting," he repeated, his voice a low growl. "People often think confidence will get them out of trouble. But you should know, confidence can easily be misinterpreted as something else." The insinuation was unmistakable. David knew Tom was deliberately twisting his composure into a reason for further suspicion. But he also realized that every word Tom spoke only revealed the insecurity and prejudice underlying his behavior. "So according to you," David said, his voice steady and unflinching, "what's the proper attitude to have when faced with an officer stopping me without any clear reason?" Tom opened his mouth to reply, but this time, no answer came immediately. Instead, he glanced around, as if searching for a new justification, a fresh excuse to maintain control. "You seem very familiar with how things work," he finally said, breaking the silence. "What kind of work do you do to know so much?" David tilted his head slightly, his gaze as sharp as a blade freshly unsheathed. "I work in a field where transparency and accountability are critical," he said, his tone enigmatic yet devoid of fear. Tom frowned, clearly agitated by his vagueness, but instead of pressing further, he took a step back, frustration flickering across his face. Deep down, David knew Tom was losing his grip on the situation, but that didn't make the tension any less palpable. Instead, it underscored something he could see clearly. Tom wasn't just stopping him to check his credentials. He wanted to make him feel small, insignificant, a goal David had no intention of letting him achieve. David observed Tom intently, his eyes steady and unflinching. After a long silence that let the tension linger, he finally spoke, his words measured and deliberate, like the edge of a sharp blade. "Officer, I'm well aware of how this process works, and I believe we can both see that it's going far beyond the initial reason for the stop." His tone wasn't raised, nor was it provocative, but it carried the weight of an unspoken accusation. Tom hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, especially not by someone like David, who exuded a calm confidence that made it clear he wasn't easily intimidated. "What are you implying?" Tom asked, though the firmness in his voice had faltered. David offered a small smile, one devoid of warmth. "I'm not implying anything, officer. I'm merely stating that everyone has the right to be treated fairly, and I don't believe what's happening here aligns with that principle." Tom clenched his jaw, the tension palpable as he grappled with the loss of control over the situation. He took a step forward, as though to reassert his authority. "You should remember," he said, his voice dropping to a colder, more menacing tone, "I'm the one in charge here, and I don't need a lecture on fairness from you." David didn't flinch, nor did he blink. "Then perhaps we should return to the matter at hand," he replied, his tone steady. "I pulled over as instructed. I've complied. I've answered all your questions. So what's next, officer?" Tom's discomfort became evident. He had no valid reason to prolong the encounter, but his inability to intimidate or subdue David left him visibly frustrated. "People like you," Tom suddenly said, his voice laced with irritation, "always think you can get away with anything." "The words landed with the force of a slap." Though he hadn't shouted, the malice and prejudice in his tone hung heavy in the air. David straightened, his gaze sharp and unwavering, now openly reflecting his indignation. "People like me," he echoed, drawing out each word with pointed precision. Tom flinched slightly, realizing his misstep, but instead of retreating, he stiffened, doubling down on his stance. "I mean people who think the rules don't apply to them." "Really?" David replied, his tone light but full of challenge. "Let me be clear. I follow the rules. I know my rights. And I also know that what's happening here has nothing to do with a minor traffic violation anymore." Tom bit his lip, struggling to maintain a semblance of authority. Yet, every word he spoke, every action he took, only served to expose his growing helplessness. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice as though to mask his impatience. "If you want to get this over with quickly, you'll keep quiet and do as I say." David crossed his arms, his eyes never leaving Tom's. When he spoke again, his voice carried a colder edge. "Officer, we both know that's not how this system is supposed to work, and I won't stay quiet while things are handled the way they shouldn't be." Tom's fists tightened, his frustration barely contained. He was acutely aware that he had pushed too far, said too much, and now stood against someone who couldn't be easily subdued. David's composure not only held firm but also forced Tom to confront himself. In that moment, he wasn't just facing a citizen, he was facing the bias and injustice that had driven his actions. But rather than step back, Tom felt an overwhelming need to reassert his power, no matter the cost. The situation teetered on the edge of a dramatic shift, and both of them knew that from this point forward, there was no turning back. David tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp as a beam of light piercing through the shadows of Tom's prejudice. He repeated Tom's earlier words, each one enunciated with deliberate meaning. "People like me?" His voice was soft, calm, not raised in anger. But it was precisely that calmness that made his question feel so much heavier. Those words hung in the air, forcing Tom to confront himself. Tom froze, his gaze faltering for a moment. He tried to mask his unease by straightening his posture, adjusting his stance as if authority alone could restore his sense of control. "That's not what I meant," he stammered, but his expression betrayed his discomfort. David didn't break eye contact. "Then what did you mean, Officer Mitchell?" he asked, his voice steady and devoid of anger, yet each word felt like a scalpel cutting through the tension between them. Tom pressed his lips together, clearly struggling to find an answer. He didn't want to admit his mistake, but he couldn't escape David's piercing gaze. "I just meant that," he hesitated, his eyes darting away before continuing in a defensive tone. "A lot of people think they can avoid responsibility. And you seem like one of them." David's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into an expression of profound disappointment. "I seem like that," he repeated, his tone calm, though his eyes carried the weight of his words. "And what exactly gives you that impression, officer? My skin color? The suit I'm wearing? Or the fact that I refuse to be intimidated by your authority?" Tom tightened his grip on his belt, his face rigid. He didn't respond immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. David could see the tension, the insecurity, and the frustration in his eyes as he struggled to maintain his usual dominance. "I don't have to answer these questions." Tom attempted to regain his composure, his voice tight with forced authority. "I'm just doing my job, and I won't let you turn this into some kind of argument." David stepped slightly closer, undeterred by Tom's larger frame or the weight of his commanding tone. "I'm not arguing, Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm simply questioning how you're doing your job. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should reflect on why." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. David's response didn't just challenge him, it forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. His actions weren't driven by duty, but by prejudice and a need to dominate. David didn't stop. He pressed on, his tone growing colder yet remaining controlled. "It seems you've underestimated how well I understand my rights," he said, his eyes unwavering. "So let me make it clear, I know my rights better than you think." Tom clenched his fists, anger and insecurity battling for control on his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like David, who refused to back down. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" Tom said, his voice dropping into a near growl, laced with a hint of a threat. "You think your clever words are going to stop me from doing my job?" David didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch between them before finally replying, each word carefully measured. "No, I don't think I'm smarter than you. But I do know this. Confidence is not a crime, and respect is not a privilege. It's something every citizen deserves, no matter what they look like." Tom took a step back, not from his words, but from the weight of his gaze. He was losing control, not just of the situation, but of himself. David knew he had pushed Tom to his limit, but he also knew that if he didn't speak up, this injustice would continue unchecked. And he was ready to face whatever consequences might come because, deep down, he understood, this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone else Tom and people like him had wronged, and would continue to wrong. The air between them was taut, a string pulled to its breaking point. Every word from David sliced through the fragile facade of authority Tom was desperately trying to maintain. Tom remained rooted in place, his eyes flickering between anger and confusion, struggling to reclaim some semblance of the power he had lost. But David wasn't about to give him a moment to find his balance. Slowly, he raised a hand to his pocket, his gaze calm yet commanding. "I'm going to take something important out." "Don't worry," he said, his words measured and deliberate, as if he controlled every second of this tense standoff. Tom instinctively stepped back, his reaction so automatic it bordered on primal. His hand briefly hovered over the holster at his hip, but he froze midway, realizing there was no overt threat from David's movements. Still, his nervous response spoke volumes. Tom wasn't facing an actual danger, but an invisible fear, one born from his own prejudices. David carefully retrieved a black leather wallet, his movements deliberate, emphasizing his full control of the situation. Yet, for the briefest moment, unease flickered within him. He knew revealing his identity could have unpredictable consequences, especially when dealing with someone already displaying signs of abuse of power. Would this revelation pacify Tom, or would it make him more volatile, feeling his authority threatened? He pushed the thought aside, refocusing on his task. His hands remained steady, his gaze unwavering, as though fear held no sway over his actions. He opened the wallet and extracted a gleaming badge, holding it up for Tom to clearly see every detail. "David Williams," he stated, his voice low and resolute. Chief of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Police Department. Tom froze, his eyes locked on the badge as if it had just dismantled his entire world. His face turned pale, and in an instant, the false confidence he had maintained throughout the encounter crumbled. "What?" Tom stammered, his voice stripped of its former toughness. His gaze darted from the badge to David, searching for an explanation, perhaps even a denial that this was real. But nothing in David's expression or demeanor suggested anything but the truth. "I oversee police conduct in this jurisdiction," David continued, his tone steady but weighted with authority. "My job is to ensure that people like you, those who wear the badge and carry its power, use it responsibly and without abuse." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. His face flushed red, not with anger, but with embarrassment and shame. He stood there, looking like a man who had just taken a hit he couldn't recover from. David's gaze never left his. "I'm not saying this to threaten you," he said, his tone utterly professional. "I'm saying this to remind you that you don't just represent yourself, you represent the entire system you serve. And today, you failed that responsibility." Tom inhaled deeply, attempting to regain some control, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. I didn't know," he muttered, his eyes still fixed on the badge in David's hand. "Didn't know." David raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Didn't know who you were dealing with, or didn't know that your actions went far beyond the boundaries of a routine traffic stop." Tom dropped his head, clearly unable to find an answer that could salvage the situation. David lowered the badge, but he didn't back down. "You might think you were just doing your job," he said, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "But the truth is, you let your own biases dictate every action you took in this situation. And that's why we're standing here, not because of a traffic violation, but because of a much deeper problem." Tom offered no response. He simply stood there, looking like a man who had just realized he'd walked into a battle he could never win. David stepped back slightly, his gaze still locked on him. He didn't need to say anything else. His presence, his confidence, and the undeniable truth of his authority spoke louder than words. In that moment, the balance of power shifted entirely, and Tom realized he wasn't just confronting an ordinary citizen. He was facing the very system he had sworn to uphold. Tom stood frozen, as if his legs had rooted themselves into the ground. His face shifted from pale to a deep crimson, a mix of shame, anger, and helplessness. His eyes avoided David's, flitting instead to the badge in his hand, as if it were the very thing that had shattered his confidence. David remained upright, his gaze cutting through Tom like a mirror reflecting every flaw he wished to hide. He didn't need to raise his voice. His tone, low, steady, and commanding, carried enough weight to demand attention. "Your actions today," David began, each word deliberately chosen, "are not just a personal failing. They represent a larger problem, one I've seen repeated in the very system you swore to serve." Tom said nothing. His body was stiff, arms hanging limply at his sides, as though bracing himself against the onslaught of David's words, but unable to muster a defense. He took a deep breath, attempting to regain his composure, but the slight tremor in his shoulders and the tight press of his lips betrayed him. David took a step closer, reducing the distance between them, just enough for Tom to feel the pressure of his presence. "You didn't stop me over a minor traffic violation," he continued, his voice devoid of anger, carrying only a cold, hard truth. "You let your biases dictate your actions. You weren't seeking justice, you were asserting power. And you picked the wrong person to do it with." Tom bit down on his lip, his eyes flashing briefly with a helplessness he couldn't hide. He couldn't deny what both of them knew to be true. "You don't need to say anything," David said, his piercing gaze unwavering. "Your silence speaks volumes." Tom lowered his head, unable to meet his eyes anymore. The silence between them grew heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken truths and looming consequences. David took a measured breath, but his expression didn't soften. "Actions like yours don't just harm people like me," he said, his voice steady. "They harm the very community you claim to protect. They erode trust in the entire system, and that is something unforgivable." Tom's mouth opened slightly, as if to say something, but no words came out. He knew that any attempt at justification now would only make things worse. David held his gaze for a moment longer before lowering his voice, though it lost none of its edge. "This isn't just about me. This is about everyone you've used your authority to intimidate. And it's about how the system has allowed behavior like yours to go unchecked." Tom stood motionless, paralyzed by his words. He understood that what had transpired tonight wasn't merely an unfortunate traffic stop. It was a moment that could define the trajectory of his career and perhaps much more. David watched his reaction, the helplessness etched clearly across Tom's face. He knew his words had struck at the core, not just of him, but of the broader system he was fighting to change. The silence lingered, far from comfortable. Tom bowed his head further as though the weight of his choices was too much to bear. David stepped back slowly, maintaining the force of his presence despite the added distance. "Remember this, Officer Mitch," he said, his voice dropping to a final chilling warning. "Your job isn't to assert power. It's to serve the community. And if you can't do that, you don't deserve to wear that badge." Tom remained silent. He simply stood there, staring at the ground, his face a portrait of shame and the dawning realization that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. When David returned to the office the next morning, the quiet space and the soft light streaming through the large glass windows offered a sense of calm. But within him, an undercurrent of tension was surging. Last night's incident wasn't merely a personal confrontation with Tom Mitchell. It was a glaring symptom of a deeper issue, one he was all too familiar with. In his role as head of internal affairs, he placed his briefcase on the desk, powered up his computer, and entered Tom Mitchell's name into the internal records management system. The results appeared instantly. Before him lay Tom's detailed profile, not just his professional achievements, but also the blemishes that had been ignored or filed away over the years. David methodically scrolled through the entries. Unprofessional behavior, abuse of authority, hostility during traffic stops. He paused at a note from a colleague. Mitchell tends to target individuals from minority groups, particularly people of color and women. Previous complaints have not been adequately addressed. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of disappointment settle over him. These actions weren't new, and Tom wasn't an isolated case. David understood all too well that the real issue lay within the system, a system that had allowed such behaviors to persist without meaningful consequences. Reaching for another file, he quickly printed out key complaints and incidents linked to Tom. This wasn't just about him. It was evidence to convince those in higher positions that the problem needed to be addressed at its roots. That afternoon, David stepped into the office of Police Chief Edward Thompson, a middle-aged man with streaks of gray in his hair and sharp, tired eyes. He sat behind a large wooden desk and looked up as David entered, holding a thick stack of documents in his hands. "David," he greeted with a nod. "I heard about what happened last night. I hope it wasn't too serious." David placed the stack firmly on the desk, his gaze unwavering. Chief, I believe what happened last night is a clear example of a much more significant issue. Thompson raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. This is Tom Mitchell's file, David began, opening the folder and sliding it toward him. What happened last night wasn't just unprofessional. This is a long history of complaints that we've overlooked or failed to address properly, and I don't think he's the only one. Thompson picked up the file and began leafing through its pages. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern, and finally, to a heavy seriousness. I won't deny there's a problem, he said, setting the file down. But these issues, David, aren't always easy to fix. We have to consider. David cut him off, his tone firm but respectful. Chief, we can't afford to consider anymore. Behavior like this not only damages the reputation of our police force, but also erodes the community's trust in us. If we don't act now, the situation will only get worse. Thompson remained silent, his eyes locked on David's, as if weighing the gravity of his words. I'm not just proposing that we address Tom Mitchell, David continued. I'm asking for a comprehensive investigation, not just into individual misconduct, but into the work culture and how we train and manage our officers. We need to fix this from the ground up. The chief leaned back in his chair, his face pensive. You realize this won't be easy, don't you? It's going to stir up a lot of resistance, not just within our ranks, but also from higher up. David nodded, his eyes resolute. I understand. But I also know that staying silent and allowing this to continue will lead to far worse consequences. If we don't act now, we're sending a message that behavior like Tom's is acceptable. And I can't stand by and let that happen. Thompson exhaled deeply, but a flicker of determination lit up his gaze. All right, he said. I'll support you in this. But you need to be prepared for what's coming. We're going to face a lot of pushback, both from within and outside the organization. David offered a faint smile, not out of victory, but because he knew he had taken the first step on a long and arduous path. Thank you, Chief. I'll be ready. As David left the meeting room, he felt the new wind blowing. It wasn't a resolution of the issue, but the beginning of a battle he was prepared to fight, not just for himself, but for the community he represented. When David left the conference room, the final words of Police Chief Edward Thompson still echoed in his mind. We're going to face a lot of pressure. He understood that clearly. He knew that a reform of this magnitude wasn't just about correcting the behavior of one individual, but embarking on a grueling journey to confront and overhaul a system that had rotted from within. Yet, with Thompson's reluctant but crucial support, David began laying out his plans. His goal wasn't just to expose Tom Mitchell's misconduct, but to address the root problem, a culture of opacity, lack of accountability, and tacit tolerance for abuse of power. Less than a week later, a notice about a comprehensive review was sent to all departments within the Sacramento Police Department. David took on the role of lead supervisor, and his team was tasked with examining every aspect, from unresolved complaints to current training and oversight procedures. Edward Thompson, though still cautious, stood by the decision, asserting, "This is an opportunity to regain the community's trust, and we won't let it go to waste." However, resistance began surfacing from the very first days. David received more than a few cold stares from senior officers who saw the review as a direct threat to their positions and authority. One of the most vocal opponents was Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, a veteran with over 20 years of service. During an internal meeting, Mark openly challenged him. "David, do you really think exposing all these faults to the public is wise? We're destroying the fragile trust they still have in us." David turned to him, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Mark, trust isn't destroyed by transparency. It's destroyed by wrongdoing we fail to address. If you don't see that, then you're a part of the problem." The exchange left the room tense, but it also made it clear that David wasn't just battling external issues, he was also confronting internal resistance. Internal meetings grew more contentious, with murmurs that he was damaging the reputation of the entire department. "This isn't the way to improve," a senior officer said during one meeting. "We need unity, not internal division." David listened, but when it was his turn to speak, his voice was firm and resolute. "Unity only matters when it's built on integrity," he replied. "If our reputation rests on hiding misconduct, then it's not a reputation worth preserving." His words plunged the room into silence. David knew that real reform couldn't just stem from within the system. It also had to arise from understanding the struggles faced by the community. He began organizing community forums where citizens could come and share their experiences with the police. During one such event, a young man, likely in his 20s, stood up, his eyes brimming with both anger and hurt. "I was stopped by the police just because I was driving an expensive car they thought I couldn't possibly own. They didn't ask me a single question, just searched every inch of my car like I was a criminal." His story left the room in silence. David listened, feeling the weight of his words. When the young man finished, he simply said, "I'm deeply sorry that happened to you, and I promise you, behavior like that will no longer be tolerated." These forums weren't easy. Stories of abuse, discrimination, and negligence echoed like heavy accusations. An older woman stood up during one session, her voice trembling but filled with emotion. "We used to trust the police, but that trust has eroded as we've seen our children treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin." David sat quietly, listening to every word. He didn't interrupt or make excuses. Instead, he absorbed the weight of each story, reminding himself that his work wasn't just a responsibility, it was a mission. David didn't stop there. He collaborated with external experts to design new training programs, focusing on two key areas: recognizing implicit biases and emphasizing personal accountability for each officer. In one training session, David stood before a group of young officers, his eyes scanning each face. "We all have biases," he said, his tone free of judgment. "But it's your responsibility to recognize them and ensure they don't influence how you enforce the law. That's what this community expects of you, and what you've sworn to do." His words left a strong impression. Though not everyone was immediately receptive, David knew change wouldn't happen overnight. It required time, patience, and unwavering determination. Beyond internal resistance, external organizations also began voicing their opinions. Some reform advocacy groups applauded David's efforts, while more conservative factions criticized him, claiming he was weakening law enforcement. David didn't let the criticism deter him. At a press conference, he addressed it head-on. "Our job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to build trust and protect everyone without discrimination. If anyone thinks this weakens our force, they've misunderstood our mission." After weeks of relentless work, a preliminary report was released, outlining significant gaps in the current system: lack of oversight, ineffective complaint handling, and a pervasive culture enabling abuse of power. David presented the report to Chief Thompson, who sat silently for several minutes after reading it. "We have a lot of work to do," he said, his voice more solemn than usual. David nodded. "But this is the first step," he replied. "And I believe we can change." As he left the office, he felt a mix of relief and resolve. What he had started wasn't just a review or a training initiative, it was an evolution in mindset, a cultural shift he hoped would not only transform this police department but also serve as a model for others. The battle was far from over, but David knew he was on the right path. A few weeks after the comprehensive review was launched, an internal hearing was convened. This was a decisive step in addressing Tom Mitchell's conduct, not just to handle the case individually, but also to send a message that abuses of power would no longer be tolerated. In the internal meeting room, light from the overhead fixtures reflected off the large wooden table. Tom sat across from the panel, his back straight, though his face betrayed tension. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the presence of senior officers, the investigative team, and most notably, David Williams. David sat at the head of the table, exuding authority without overt intimidation. His intent was clear, to uncover the truth, not only about Tom but also about the systemic failures that had enabled his behavior. As the hearing commenced, the investigative team presented the results of their review. Past complaints against Tom Mitchell were laid out in detail. Abuses of authority during traffic stops and overt hostility toward individuals from minority groups. The first complaint against Officer Mitchell was filed 3 years ago, one investigator began, his tone cold as he read from the report. A citizen alleged that he used discriminatory language during a traffic stop. However, the complaint was dismissed due to insufficient evidence, and no action was taken. Tom sat motionless, his hands clenched on his lap. He didn't attempt to justify himself, partly because he knew every pair of eyes in the room was poised to dismantle any defense he might offer. David remained silent throughout the presentation, quietly taking notes. His gaze, however, never left Tom, ensuring he felt the weight of every accusation. When it was Tom's turn to speak, his voice was hoarse and slightly shaky, a stark contrast to the confidence he had displayed when confronting David that night. "I admit I've made some mistakes," he began, his eyes avoiding David. "But I don't believe those mistakes are severe enough to overshadow my entire career. I was just doing my job, and sometimes I was misunderstood." David gave no immediate reaction, but his unwavering gaze made it clear he was unconvinced. One of the investigators asked, "So do you acknowledge that your actions in the situations we've outlined were inappropriate?" Tom hesitated before finally replying, "I acknowledge that I may have acted too rigidly at times, but I never intended to harm anyone." After Tom finished, David spoke, his voice calm yet carrying immense authority. "Officer Mitchell's behavior is not just a personal issue," he said, turning his attention to the senior officers in the room. "It is a glaring manifestation of a system that has failed to uphold accountability and transparency. Actions like these cannot be dismissed as misunderstandings. They are matters of ethics, power, and how we treat the community we've sworn to protect." He turned back to Tom, his gaze unflinching. "You say you never intended to harm anyone, but your actions, intentional or not, have caused harm. Not only to those you've wronged, but also to this entire police force. And that is something we cannot deny." After hours of discussion, the final decision was announced. Tom Mitchell was suspended indefinitely and required to undergo comprehensive retraining. But no sooner had the punishment been declared than a group of veteran officers signed a petition accusing David's actions of being overly harsh and divisive. The petitions quickly circulated within the department, prompting Chief Edward Thompson to call an emergency meeting. David faced a barrage of criticism. One senior officer remarked, "We're undermining the morale of the entire force. A personal mistake doesn't warrant such severe consequences." David stood firm. This personal mistake was tolerated for years. If we don't act now, Our promises of fairness and transparency are nothing more than empty words." While the punishment stopped short of outright dismissal, it sent a strong message that such behavior would no longer be condoned. More importantly, it signaled that the system was beginning to change. As Tom left the room, his expression was vacant, as though the weight of consequences he never anticipated had finally settled on him. As the hearing concluded, David addressed those remaining in the room, his voice resolute. "This isn't just about Tom MCH, he said. "This is about the system we've built and what we've allowed to happen within it. This is our opportunity to fix it, to build a culture we can be proud of. And I won't stop until that becomes a reality." David's words were not just a closing statement for the hearing, they were a declaration of his commitment to the reform he had set in motion. And while the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, he knew he was one step closer to his goal, a system that was fair, transparent, and worthy of the community's trust. A few weeks after the hearing, on a warm, sunlit evening in Sacramento, a community event was held at a large conference center. Hundreds of local residents gathered, elders who had witnessed societal changes and young people full of hope for the future. All eyes were fixed on the stage where David Williams was about to take the podium. Standing backstage, David adjusted the microphone clipped to his shirt. The murmurs in the hall gradually quieted as the host introduced him, emphasizing that David was not just a leader but a symbol of change, a person willing to face challenges head-on to rebuild trust within the community. David walked to the podium with a confident demeanor. The stage lights illuminated his face, and in his eyes, one could see both determination and compassion. He surveyed the room, taking a brief moment to silently connect with the audience before speaking. "When I stepped into this role, I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be challenges, criticisms, and even resistance. But I also knew that if we didn't start somewhere, the issues we're facing would never be resolved." His voice rang out clear and strong, commanding the attention of everyone present. "In the past few weeks, we've seen misconduct brought to light. But this isn't just about one individual. This is about a system that has allowed injustice to persist. And I'm here to say, we will not let that continue." A round of applause erupted from the audience, but David raised his hand gently to signal for silence. He wasn't done. "Justice isn't just about holding wrongdoers accountable," he continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Justice is about ensuring that those entrusted with enforcing the law do the right thing. Justice means respect, transparency, and fairness, not just for some, but for everyone." David scanned the room, his gaze meeting each face. "I understand that trust in law enforcement has been shaken. I know that some of you here have endured injustice, and I know that words alone cannot erase those wounds. But I promise you, action will." He paused briefly, letting his words sink in. Then he resumed, his tone even firmer. "We have initiated reforms, not just in how we address officers who act improperly, but in how we train, oversee, and communicate with our community. This is my commitment to you. I will not stop until trust is restored." Once again, applause filled the room, louder and more fervent this time. But this time, David didn't ask them to stop. He let their support ripple through the hall, an affirmation that his mission was the right one. David's tone softened, and his gaze grew more tender as he delivered his closing words. "We have a long road ahead. But I believe that with determination and courage, we can build a future where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, can feel safe and respected. And I promise you, I will not stop fighting for that." He stepped down from the podium to resounding applause. The crowd rose to their feet, expressing their overwhelming support. David smiled gently, but inside, his resolve grew even stronger. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. As he left the hall, David's eyes remained focused forward. The future held more challenges, but with every step, he felt closer to achieving a just system and a community built on trust. That was a goal he would never abandon. David Williams' story is not just a personal journey of confronting injustice. It's a powerful reminder that anyone can spark change by standing up for what's right. His fight for justice has not only delivered accountability, but also planted hope for a more transparent and fair system. So, what about you? If you were in David's shoes or had witnessed injustice, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to catch more meaningful stories. Together, we can spark vital conversations to build a better society.